Imagine trying to completely rewrite the fundamental software of a computer,
Right.
but it is actively flying a passenger jet through, like, a Category 5 hurricane.
Oh, wow. Yeah, this is a total nightmare scenario.
Right. But instead of a computer, we are talking about a centuries-old civilization. And instead of software, we are talking about the core.
Yeah, a way to get those real aha moments without drowning in all that academic jargon.
Exactly. And today, we have a mission that is perfectly tailored for that exact curiosity. We are exploring the intellectual earthquake described in Majid Fakhry's book, A History of Islamic Philosophy.
Specifically focusing on a chapter dedicated to modernist trends.
Right.
Because we are looking at a profound, almost violent intellectual collision. How did Islamic philosophers in the 19th and 20th centuries grapple with a radically and rapidly changing world?
I mean, they're looking outward at European dominance, right? Steam engines, telegraphs, advanced military tactics.
Yeah, and then looking inward at what they perceived as their own philosophical stagnation. I mean, for centuries, the Islamic world had been the undisputed center of scientific and philosophical advancement.
But by the 1800s, that power dynamic had completely flipped.
Completely.
So I want to tease this right up front. This is not just dusty, distant history. This is a masterclass in how any deeply held belief system attempts to survive and adapt when the paradigm shifts completely.
Yeah, whether that's your own personal philosophies or even like the corporate culture at your job.
Exactly. We are going to see revolutionary intellectuals. We are going to see some really wild philosophical tightrope walks. And we're going to end with a very stark warning about the dangers of marrying eternal truths to modern science.
But before we jump into the first major figure, I think it is worth laying down a quick ground rule about the nature of this discussion.
Oh, right. Good call.
The thinkers we are unpacking today, they were living in a pressure cooker.
Yeah, they were.
And because of that, they offer some incredibly strong and, frankly, very provocative critiques. They launch heavy arguments against various religions, including Christianity and Hinduism.
Right.
They tear into political movements, too, like socialism, communism, the French Revolution. They have these huge, sweeping judgments about different cultures and historical eras.
And our role here is simply to lift the hood on their arguments. We want to see how the engine of their logic works.
Exactly. We are not here to endorse or validate their political or theological viewpoints. We are just trying to understand why they felt compelled to make these arguments and how those ideas shaped history.
We're just the guides through the museum. We didn't paint the exhibits.
I like that.
So, to understand how a massive intellectual shift happens, we have to start with the instigator. You don't update a civilization's worldview with quiet, timid contemplation. You need a revolutionary.
You really do.
And that brings us to Jamal al-Din al-Afghani.
Al-Afghani is basically the quintessential spark of this modernist movement. He was born in 1839, and his origins are actually a bit debated.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he either hailed from Asadabad in Persia, which is modern-day Iran, or Asadabad in Afghanistan. But honestly, regardless of where he took his first breath, he became a true citizen of the world.
Right, he was everywhere.
He was an itinerant intellectual. He traveled to Persia, India, Egypt, Yemen, Turkey, Russia, England, France. I mean, he just did not stop moving.
And through all this travel, he became acutely, painfully aware of the Muslim world's condition relative to Europe.
Yeah, he looked around and saw just deep apathy.
He saw populations that were falling behind in technology and political organization, military strength. He saw what he called their ignorance and backwardness in the face of European dominance.
And he was a political activist as much as a philosopher. He was not the type of thinker to just sit in a library and write obscure treatises for other scholars.
No, he was in the trenches.
Exactly. I mean, he collaborated on this inflammatory gazette in Paris in 1884 called Al-Urwa al-Wuthqa, calling for the union of all Muslims and the restoration of the caliphate.
Wow.
And he engaged with prominent European thinkers. Like when he spoke to the French philosopher Ernest Renan, Renan felt like he was hearing the echoes of the great free-thinking Islamic rationalists from centuries past.
He just had this incredible magnetic presence.
He really did.
So his biggest intellectual footprint in our source material is a published work called The Refutation of the Materialists, or sometimes translated as naturalists.
Yes.
And he is throwing a very wide net here. He is targeting the godless philosophies of his time.
Yeah, he goes after Indian thinkers known as the naturists or naturalists, who we will definitely talk about later.
Right.
But he also goes after Charles Darwin, the ancient Greek philosopher Democritus, and European socialists. He just lumps them all together under one giant umbrella materialists.
And to al-Afghani, materialism was the ultimate corrosive agent to civilization.
It was the enemy.
But when we talk about materialism in this context, we aren't talking about people who like to buy expensive shoes, right?
No, no, not consumerism. We
Yeah.
are talking about the philosophical belief that nothing exists except physical matter.
Right, no soul.
Exactly. No soul, no divine plan, no higher moral order, just atoms colliding in the void.
And in his refutation, al-Afghani sets out to prove that religion is not just a spiritual comfort, but the absolute bedrock of civilization and progress.
Yeah, he breaks this down into a very systematic thesis. He argues that religion teaches humanity three fundamental truths.
Okay, let's unpack these because they are fascinatingly pragmatic. First, he argues that religion teaches man his angelic or spiritual nature. Basically, we aren't just beasts. We are the lords of creation.
And this is a crucial starting point for him. He argues that this belief generates the urge to rise above our basic animalistic proclivities.
Right.
It allows us to live in peace and hold our destructive impulses in check. I mean, think about the psychological impact of that.
Well, yeah, if you fundamentally believe you are just matter, just an animal driven by base instincts, you'll probably act like one.
Precisely. But if you believe you have a spark of the divine, spiritual nature, you are suddenly burdened with a higher standard of behavior.
That makes sense. Okay, so the second truth he outlines is a bit more competitive. He argues religion teaches the belief that one's own religious community is superior to all others.
Which I know sounds incredibly abrasive to modern ears.
Very.
But al-Afghani sees it as an evolutionary driver disguised as theology. He argues that this sense of superiority is actually a positive engine for civilization.
How so?
Well, it generates competitiveness. If a nation truly believes it is superior, it will strive incessantly to prove it.
Oh, I see.
They will foster knowledge, cultivate arts, build better infrastructure, and improve their lot in the world, just to justify that belief.
Okay, that is a very pragmatic way to look at religious chauvinism. And then the third truth is the realization that this life is just a prelude to a higher, sorrow-free afterlife.
Right.
He argues this makes people cleanse themselves of malice and live by peace and justice because they are keeping their eyes on the prize.
Exactly. But he doesn't stop at these three truths. He argues religion also implants three specific traits in people: modesty, honesty, and truthfulness.
And he doesn't just present these as nice moral guidelines you like cross-stitch onto a pillow.
No. He uses these traits to construct a grand unified theory of historical rise and fall.
Right.
He applies this framework to the major nations of the world to prove that when these traits are present, civilizations rise, and when materialism strips them away, civilizations collapse.
He basically takes us on a historical world tour, and he starts with the ancient Greeks.
According to al-Afghani, the Greeks were a small nation that managed to stand up to and destroy the mighty Persian Empire precisely because they possessed these religious virtues.
They had a strong moral core.
Yes. But then, he argues, the materialism and hedonism of Epicurus crept in.
Right. Epicurean naturalism, which is
Right.
essentially the philosophy that the universe is just atoms and void, there is no divine intervention, and the highest good is just the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain.
Exactly. And al-Afghani argues this philosophy eroded the Greek concept of man's dignity and heavenly destiny.
So cynicism and moral decay set in, and the Greeks were eventually conquered by the Romans.
Yep. And he applies the exact same logic to the Persians falling to the Arabs.
Yeah.
But where he gets incredibly specific and politically charged for his time is when he analyzes France.
Oh, his analysis of French history is a huge centerpiece of his argument.
Huge. He acknowledges that post-Roman France rose to preeminence in science and art. But then comes the 18th century, the Enlightenment.
And he points the finger directly at Voltaire and Rousseau.
He does. He accuses them of reviving the old naturalism of Epicurus under the guise of enlightenment and reason.
He claims they replaced God with the goddess of reason, dismissing religious beliefs as mere superstitions.
And in al-Afghani's view, this wasn't just a philosophical misstep in some Parisian salon. It was a civilizational suicide pact.
Wow.
He blames these doctrines directly for plunging France into the bloodbath of the French Revolution.
And he attributes France's subsequent calamities, like the rise of socialism and the Prussian occupation, to this complete loss of a religious foundation.
Yeah, and he extends this critique to the nihilists, socialists, and communists of his own 19th century. He views their attempts to abolish privilege and communize property, all under the pretext of championing the poor, as fundamentally destructive.
Because their attack on religion and monarchy is based on the premise that everything is just nature, just material forces.
Right. He actually writes a plea for God to protect people from their evil words and deeds. He warns that if these materialists consolidated power, the human race would literally be threatened with extermination.
That is intense.
It is a theory of history infused with intense religious pathos. But here is the massive paradox of al-Afghani.
Okay.
Despite this fierce, almost apocalyptic defense of religion against materialism, he is not advocating for a return to pure mysticism or, like, blind, unquestioning faith. He champions a radical rationalism.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is a wild contradiction.
No.
He is defending religion to the death against secular rationalists like Voltaire, but then he turns around and says Islam has absolutely no mysteries whatsoever.
That's exactly what he says.
Yeah.
He believed that genuine religious beliefs must be founded upon sound demonstrations and valid logical proofs.
So no leaps of faith.
None. He explicitly rejected the doubtful fancies of ancestors, the supernatural mysticism of the Sufis, and even the traditional Asharite theologians who emphasized God's unknowable will. He claimed the mark of Islam's superiority over all other religions, and he specifically singles out Hinduism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism here, is that its fundamental dogmas can be fully rationalized.
So, wait. He is basically treating religion like a societal operating system?
Exactly.
It's a highly practical, logical tool designed to generate civilization, enforce morality, and frankly, win wars.
Yes.
But wait, if he claims Islam has zero mysteries and every single dogma is just a logical proof, isn't he stripping the actual magic or soul out of the religion? I mean, he sounds more like a pragmatic politician writing a constitution than a spiritual leader talking about the divine.
What's fascinating here is that your analogy captures his exact intent. Al-Afghani was a political revolutionary fired by religious zeal.
Okay.
He reduced religion to a rationalist system precisely to make it a weapon. He needed a robust, logical framework that could stand toe-to-toe with European science and intellect, while also serving as a unifying call to arms against internal apathy.
Right, because he knew he couldn't fight the British Empire with mystical poetry or passive meditation.
Exactly. He needed a religion that functioned as an undeniable, logical imperative for progress and unity.
It's brilliant strategy, but you can see how that sets up a massive tension. He's telling people to have ultimate faith, but only because it makes logical societal sense.
It's a tightrope walk.
So al-Afghani provided the revolutionary spark. He's traveling the world and dropping these intellectual bombs. But a revolution needs an architect to build the actual institutions, right?
Right. You need someone to write the manuals and implement the curriculum.
And he found that builder in Egypt, his greatest disciple, Muhammad Abdu.
Muhammad Abdu is a towering figure in modern Islamic thought. Born in 1849 in Egypt, he actually initially pursued a very traditional education. In 1866, he entered Al-Azhar, which is one of the most ancient and prestigious centers of Islamic learning in the entire world. But Abdu quickly grew frustrated and disillusioned.
He was stifled by the antiquated curriculum. And to give you some context on how rigid things were at that time, Al-Azhar basically considered philosophy to be a heresy.
Yeah, they weren't teaching it at all.
Because the earlier Islamic philosophers had engaged so heavily with Greek thought that the traditionalists eventually shut it down, fearing it would corrupt the pure faith.
Exactly. So here is Abdu, hungry for knowledge, hitting a massive brick wall, and then he meets al-Afghani.
Right.
And al-Afghani had been trained in the Persian tradition, where philosophy and theology were still deeply intertwined.
So al-Afghani began teaching Abdu the forbidden subjects: logic, astronomy, metaphysics, and theosophy.
But perhaps more importantly, al-Afghani awakened Abdu's public spirit, because Abdu had been leaning toward a kind of quietist Sufism.
Let's define that for a second.
Yeah.
What does quietist Sufism actually look like in practice?
Imagine looking at a world that is falling apart. Armies invading, economies crashing, society fracturing, and deciding the best response is to completely turn off the news, retreat to a quiet room, and focus entirely on your own internal mystical connection with God.
So just total isolation.
Yeah, it is a complete withdrawal from the physical political world into a purely spiritual realm.
And al-Afghani basically shook him by the shoulders, pulled him out of that retreat, and infused him with a concern for public affairs, national emancipation, and intellectual freedom.
He essentially told him, you can't just meditate while the country falls apart. You have to get out there and build something.
And Abdu took that to heart. He had an incredibly active career. He became the editor of the Official Gazette, a member of the Education Council, and eventually the Grand Mufti of Egypt, which is the highest official of religious law.
But for our purpose today, his most important contribution is his masterwork, Risalat al-Tawhid, or the Theology of Unity.
This treatise is a massive landmark. In it, Abdu makes a sweeping historical and theological argument. He asserts that prior to Islam, religions relied on the supernatural to prove their point.
Right, they relied on miracles, legends, and rhetorical tricks to force people into belief.
But the Quran, he argues, changed all that. It appealed directly to reason.
Yes. His central thesis is that reason and religion marched in unison for the first time in the Quran. He claims the text actually demands proof and demonstration, and that it rationally dismantles the views of disbelievers.
Therefore, he concludes that blind acceptance, the Arabic term is taqlid, is fundamentally un-Islamic. You are supposed to think for yourself. You are commanded to use your intellect.
He builds a very structured, scholastic core to this argument. He defines God as a necessary being.
Which is a heavy philosophical term. Let's break that down. A necessary being means what, exactly?
It means a being whose non-existence is impossible. Think of it like the foundation of a building. Everything else in the universe is contingent. It might exist, it might not exist.
Like you and me.
Exactly. You and I are contingent. Our existence depends on our parents, who depended on their parents, and so on. A necessary being is the uncaused cause, the ultimate bedrock.
So if the necessary being doesn't exist, nothing else can exist.
Right. And Abdu defines this God with existential attributes, life, knowledge, and will. But he is very careful to distinguish this from popular, uneducated concepts of God.
Yeah, he takes direct aim at the idea of an arbitrary God. He says you can't just picture God as a capricious despot sitting on a cloud throwing lightning bolts randomly.
God's will is a corollary of his knowledge. Everything he does is dictated by supreme wisdom and order. You can see this order in the harmony of the universe and the laws of physics and nature.
And this rationalist defense of Islam wasn't just an internal academic exercise for reform. It was actively deployed against European critics.
Oh, absolutely. We see this vividly in a famous debate Abdu had with Gabriel Hanotaux, who was the French foreign minister in 1900.
Right. Hanotaux raised what he called the question of Islam, basically arguing that Islam was inherently incapable of coping with modern civilization.
Hanotaux's argument was that Islam caused fatalism and backwardness. And his main point of contention was that Islam didn't separate church and state.
It didn't have that Christian concept of rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
Yes. And Abdu's defense here is a classic counterattack. First, he points out that the decline of the Muslim world wasn't caused by the religion itself, but by foreign elements infiltrating and corrupting the original rational faith over centuries.
And regarding the separation of church and state, Abdu flips Hanotaux's critique entirely on its head.
He really does.
He argues that Islam's superiority lies precisely in not separating the spiritual and temporal realms. Islam, he argues, doesn't leave Caesar to his own devices.
It doesn't give politicians a free pass to act ruthlessly in the secular world.
It subordinates Caesar to God. It holds political power accountable to moral and spiritual laws.
And he contrasts this with Christian asceticism, arguing that Islam promotes a healthy body and the moderate enjoyment of life's pleasures rather than cutting oneself off from the world.
It's a very robust, confident defense. But here's where it gets really interesting. There is a moment in his philosophy that feels like a massive contradiction.
Okay, where do you see the contradiction?
Well, Abdu is championing this extreme rationalism.
Right.
He is saying reason is the ultimate arbiter, blind faith is terrible, and you must use logic.
Right.
But then he quotes a tradition saying, reflect upon God's creation, but not upon his nature, or else you will perish. He is acting exactly like a tech developer defining user permissions.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. He's telling humanity that our reason can understand the interface, the rules of nature, physics, biology, the accidental aspects of things. But we are strictly locked out of the source code.
Yeah.
We are not allowed to use our reason to investigate the genuine essence of God or the true nature of the soul. How can you be a radical rationalist and then suddenly draw a line in the sand and say, stop thinking about that part?
It is a brilliant catch, and it really highlights the immense political and social pressure Abdu was under. You are right, it is a hard boundary line. But Abdu would argue it's a logical boundary line, not a fearful one.
Meaning what?
He argues that the knowledge of the genuine essences of things doesn't enter into the human economy of utility. It simply isn't useful for building a society.
Oh, so it's above our pay grade, and trying to figure it out doesn't help build railroads or universities.
Exactly. He argues it is enough to know that you have a soul. Spending your life pondering whether it is a substance or an accident is a fruitless question.
Just a waste of time.
Right. It is enough to know God is eternal. Pondering the mechanics of whether his attributes are separate from his essence is frivolous. What he is doing here is bridging a massive gap.
Right.
He is holding on to the extreme rationalism he learned from al-Afghani, but he is also trying to align with the tradition of the pious forebears, the al-Salaf.
So he's trying not to alienate the traditionalists while still pushing the society forward into the modern age.
He saw what happened to earlier Islamic philosophers who got entirely bogged down in endless, unresolvable theological squabbles about the nature of God. It paralyzed the society. He wanted human reason directed outward at the practical world, at science, at governance, at resisting imperialism, not lost inward in metaphysical navel-gazing.
That makes perfect sense pragmatically. So we have al-Afghani lighting the fire, traveling the world, and Abdu building the intellectual framework in Egypt to make Islam compatible with modern rationalism.
Yes.
You would think this logical, well-structured approach would lead to an era of unbridled, unified, progressive philosophy across the entire Muslim world.
You'd hope so. But as history constantly reminds us, ideological movements rarely move in a straight line.
Almost never.
As the pressure of modernity mounted, as colonialism entrenched itself deeper and Western science accelerated at a dizzying pace, the intellectual responses fractured dramatically.
Right, because while Abdu was trying to carefully thread the needle in Egypt, other thinkers were taking his premises in wildly different directions. Let's look at Abdu's own direct disciple, Rashid Rida.
Rashid Rida is a perfect example of this ideological fracturing. He actually emigrated from Lebanon to Egypt specifically to study under Abdu. He was fired up by the same journal al-Afghani started. He even founded his own journal, Al-Manar, dedicated to the reform and rejuvenation of Islam. But instead of pushing further into liberal rationalism, Rida took the movement in a strict fundamentalist direction.
The cornerstone of his program was the necessity of returning to the straight path of the good forebears, the al-Salaf al-Salih.
Yes, and this is where the term Salafi movement comes from. Rida essentially argued that all the subsequent philosophical and theological developments over the centuries were heresies that weakened Islam.
He believed the only way to survive the modern onslaught was to purge all that accumulated philosophy and go back to the original, pure source of the early days of the religion.
It is a profound defensive anchor. When the present is terrifying and the future is deeply uncertain, a very natural psychological response for a civilization is to idealize the past.
Of course.
Rida's approach was a neo-Hanbalite exhortation. And to understand that, we need to know who Hanbal was.
Let's do it.
Ahmad ibn Hanbal was a 9th century Islamic scholar who championed strict reliance on the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet, heavily distrusting any human reasoning or speculative theology.
So Rida was reviving this strict textualism, but phrasing it in modern political terms to resist Western cultural decay.
Exactly.
So that is one reaction. Build a time machine, go back to the Golden Age, and pull up the drawbridge.
Right.
But if we move over to India, we see a completely different, almost opposite survival strategy. And the context here is crucial. We're looking at the aftermath of the 1857 mutiny in India against British rule.
The rebellion had just been crushed brutally. The Muslim population there was facing intense British scrutiny, marginalization, and a real fear for their physical and cultural survival.
Enter Sayyid Ahmad Khan.
Ahmad Khan looked at the situation and realized that direct, violent resistance was futile and counterproductive. He believed the only way forward was an Anglo-Muslim rapprochement.
He visited England in 1870, and his enthusiasm for British culture became incredibly profound.
He founded the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, which later became the University of Aligarh, designed to teach Western sciences alongside Islamic theology.
But theologically, he performed what looks like radical surgery on Islam to make it fit this new reality. He developed a syncretic brand of Islam that, practically speaking, didn't differ radically from liberal Christianity.
And he became known as a Nekhari, a naturalist. For Ahmad Khan, the ultimate test of religious truth was its conformity with the norms of natural reason.
So he methodically expunged the supernatural elements from the faith.
He did. When he interpreted the Quran, he explained away miracles or extraordinary episodes naturalistically. He rejected vast swaths of tradition.
If a belief or practice was deemed incompatible with modern natural morality, such as warfare, slavery, or the subjugation of women, he disavowed it as a later corruption, not part of the true faith.
Let's give a concrete example of this because it's a massive shift.
Yeah. How does a naturalist like Khan explain something clearly supernatural in the text, like angels, or the parting of the Red Sea, or jinns?
He redefines them entirely using science and sociology.
Okay.
For example, traditional theology views jinns as supernatural creatures made of smokeless fire. Khan argued that references to jinns were actually just describing primitive, nomadic human tribes, or perhaps psychological forces within human beings.
Wow.
He argued that angels aren't winged celestial beings, but rather the moral faculties inside humans, or simply natural forces governing the physical world.
What about the miracles?
He looked at miracles like the parting of the Red Sea and explained them through tides, volcanic activity, or meteorological phenomena.
He completely demystifies it. He turns the text into a Victorian science and ethics manual.
He really does.
That is a fascinating survival mechanism. He essentially stripped the religion down to a purely natural morality that was completely compatible with the British ideals of the time. He wanted assimilation to guarantee survival.
Yes.
But then also in India, we have a third figure who takes yet another path, Sayyid Amir Ali.
Amir Ali is described as a romantic liberal. He was in sympathy with Ahmad Khan's liberal views, but he went a step further in his defense. He didn't just want to apologize and assimilate,
He wrote a highly influential book called The Spirit of Islam.
and instead of just arguing that Islam is compatible with modern liberalism, Amir Ali went on the offensive. He argued that the spirit of Islam is actually the absolute core of liberalism.
He uses historical scholarship to claim that all the great ideas of Western Christendom and Western science actually have their solid basis in Islamic teaching.
And he doesn't hold back on his critiques of other religions to make this point.
No, he is particularly harsh on historical Christianity. He attributes the spectacular success of Islam in the 7th century to the general decadence and depravity into which, he claims, the world had been plunged by Christianity.
He argues Islam had to emerge to rescue the world from the dark ages that Christian dogma had created.
And when European critics pointed out the darker, more violent, or stagnant periods in Islamic history, Amir Ali just waved them away.
He explained them as natural human errors, the consequences of political corruption that any culture faces.
But he insisted the core religion itself maintained an immunity to corruption. He put on these massive rose-colored glasses to view history, romanticizing it entirely to build confidence in the modern Muslim identity.
And just to show how far-reaching this identity crisis was, our source briefly takes us to Southeast Asia. We see historical tensions there between Sufi mysticism, specifically the Wujudiya school, or unity of being, which is a highly philosophical, almost pantheistic view of God,
Right.
and Orthodox scholars who accuse them of heresy. But zooming into the contemporary era, we see a scholar named Muhammad Iqbal al-Atas.
And Alatis brings us full circle to that intense defensive posture against the West. He asserts that Islam legislates for all aspects of life, public and private.
And he goes so far as to claim that Christianity isn't even a revealed religion anymore, but merely a sophisticated form of cultural religion because it lacks public legislation and embraces secularism.
It is a fascinating echo of Hanoto's critique, turned completely back around onto Europe.
These varying responses, from Rita's strict fundamentalism to Khan's naturalism to Amir Ali's romanticism, they perfectly illustrate how existential crisis breeds profound intellectual diversity.
Right.
These were not just ivory tower theological debates about angels on the head of a pin. These were desperate, vital attempts to secure psychological, cultural, and physical survival in an era where the West seemed politically and scientifically omnipotent.
So what does this all mean? We have Rita wanting to build a time machine to the past, Ahmad Khan wanting to essentially become culturally British, and Amir Ali putting on rose-colored glasses to view history.
Yeah.
It sounds like a massive civilizational identity crisis. They're all reading the same book, but coming up with entirely different survival strategies.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, every thinker was trying to find a way for a Muslim in the modern world to hold their head high.
But those are ultimately defensive strategies. They are reactions. To truly bring Islamic philosophy into the modern era, to move from defense to offense, a thinker needed to stop apologizing and start synthesizing.
Yes.
Enter Muhammad Iqbal, who decided to use the heavy artillery of Western physics and philosophy to prove Islam's cutting-edge relevance.
Muhammad Iqbal is arguably the most ambitious figure in this entire narrative. Born in 1878 in the Punjab, he was a poet of profound sensibility and a scholar with a vast philosophical education.
He studied in England and Germany.
He did. And what he saw in Europe deeply affected him in both positive and negative ways. He was incredibly impressed by the vitality and dynamism of European life and the immense possibilities open to humanity through science.
But he also saw a deep flaw. He saw the dehumanizing influence that capitalist society and aggressive industrialization had on the European soul.
And that realization strengthened his faith in the superiority of Islam as a moral and spiritual ideal. He felt Europe had the science but lacked the soul.
However, he knew that to defend and develop the Islamic ideal, he couldn't rely on the old scholastic arguments of Abdu or the historical romanticism of Amir Ali. The world had moved on.
So he delivered a series of lectures in 1928 that became his masterwork, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. And the intellectual toolkit he brings into this reconstruction is staggering.
He is drawing on Hegelian dialectics, Alfred North Whitehead, Henri Bergson's theories of creative evolution, and Albert Einstein's theory of relativity.
It's a lot. To understand what Iqbal is doing, we have to understand the concepts he was borrowing. Let's look at Bergson's creative evolution.
Okay.
Before Bergson, a lot of philosophy treated time like a ticking clock, a rigid mathematical progression. Bergson argued that time is actually duration, a flowing, continuous stream of change.
So reality isn't a static object, it is constant creative evolution.
Exactly. And Iqbal took this concept and aimed it at what he called the block universe.
The block universe being the idea that the universe is a finished product. It's a completed machine that God wound up like a clockmaker and then stepped away from, just watching it tick down.
Right, and Iqbal vehemently rejected this. Drawing on Bergson in his reading of the Quran, he argued that the universe is continually realizing itself across space and time. It is an ongoing live process of creation.
And where does humanity fit into that dynamic process? Iqbal argues that man is a co-worker with God in the process of realizing the infinite potentialities of reality.
That is a massively empowering idea. We aren't just passive subjects waiting for judgment. We are active participants in creation.
To ground this philosophically, Iqbal performed a breathtaking reinterpretation of classical Islamic thought. We mentioned earlier the traditional Asharite theologians.
Yes, the Asherites believed in an atomistic universe. They believed that God constantly creates and recreates atoms at every single moment. Reality doesn't exist on its own. It is sustained millisecond by God.
Think of it like frames in a movie or pixels on a screen. The Asherites believed God is actively drawing every single pixel frame by frame.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And Iqbal took this ancient theological concept and merged it with modern physics and a philosophical concept called monadology.
Let's break down monadology. This comes from the philosopher Leibniz, right?
Yes. Leibniz argued that the universe isn't made of dead, inert matter like rocks or basic atoms. It is made up of monads, which are tiny, indivisible, spiritual units of reality.
Okay.
And every monad has a kind of perception or consciousness. Iqbal adapted this. He argued that the universe is made up of spiritual egos. Every particle of reality is a self, an ego. The higher the consciousness, the closer that entity is to God, who is the ultimate ego.
He essentially argued that the ancient Muslim theologians had anticipated the non-material, dynamic nature of reality that quantum physics and relativity were just beginning to uncover in the 1920s.
He took Einstein's theory of relativity, which showed that space and time are not rigid containers, but flexible and intertwined, and claimed this perfectly matched the Quranic conception of a dynamic God, the first and the last, the visible and the invisible.
And he didn't just stop at physics. He made some audacious historical claims to back up this fusion. He argued that the birth of Islam actually marked the birth of the inductive intellect, what we would call empiricism or the scientific method.
He claimed that Greek thought, with its focus on Plato and Aristotle, was too obsessed with abstract theory, logic puzzles, and proportion. It wasn't rooted in the real world.
But Muslim thought, he argued, was focused on the concrete, the observable, the scientific.
Right, he asks a rhetorical question in his lectures. Where did Roger Bacon receive his scientific training?
Bacon, being the 13th century friar, often credited with introducing the scientific method to Europe.
And Iqbal answers his own question. In the Muslim universities of Spain, he is basically claiming the entire foundation of modern European science is an Islamic export.
He saw a universe of continuous creation, not bound by serial time, but existing in a dynamic growth, which he felt vindicated the most mystical yet rational interpretations of Islam.
Yes.
I have to jump in here because the ambition is absolutely staggering.
It really is.
Iqbal is looking at the most mind-bending revolutionary physics of the 20th century relativity, early quantum shifts, and saying, yeah, the Quran knew this all along.
Yeah.
It's like he's treating the universe not as a finished painting hanging in a gallery, but as an ongoing live stream. And human beings are literally in the developer seat alongside God, writing the code as we go. It is a beautiful, intoxicating vision.
It is.
But I have to ask, is he forcing a puzzle piece where it just doesn't fit? Is he stretching these ancient 7th century verses too far to make them shake hands with Albert Einstein?
That is the exact tension at the heart of his work. What Iqbal was attempting was monumental, but it wasn't unprecedented. If we look back a millennium, Islamic thinkers like Al-Kindi and Ibn Rushd attempted a massive synthesis. They tried to harmonize the Quran with the prevailing science of their day, which was the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. Iqbal was attempting the exact same civilizational synthesis, but swapping out the ancient Greeks for Einstein, Whitehead, and Bergson.
It is a brilliant, highly eclectic attempt to bridge speculative thought and religion.
But the author of our source text, Majid Fakhry, is not entirely convinced by this incredible synthesis.
And this brings us to the final critique, the trap of modernism. Because while Iqbal's fusion of ancient faith and modern science sounds incredible on paper, Fakhry points out a massive existential vulnerability in this whole modernist strategy.
Fakhry is quite critical here.
Yeah.
He points out two major flaws in the approaches of Iqbal and other liberal interpreters. The first is what he calls the unforgivable sin of ignoring the historical dimension of Islam.
Specifically, he mentions the concept of asbab al-nuzul.
Let's define that. Asbab al-nuzul translates to the historical circumstances in which specific revelations were made. It is the context.
Exactly. Traditional Islamic scholarship always placed heavy emphasis on understanding why and when a specific verse was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. Was it during a battle? Was it a legal ruling for a specific dispute? It grounded the text in history.
And Fakhry argues that modernists like Iqbal tend to ignore that context. They lift ancient verses completely out of their historical setting and read purely Hegelian or Bergsonian concepts into them through very tenuous linguistic links.
Because if you ignore the context, you can essentially make the text mean literally anything you want it to mean. You turn over the interpretation of the Quran to a strange assortment of Western scientists.
Fakhry implies that if you do this too much, you are relying on hidden meanings and abandoning the actual text. You lose the anchor.
But Fakhry's second critique is even more devastating, and it reveals the ultimate trap of modernism.
Yes.
He argues that the most dangerous error a modernist can make is to wed the eternal religious truth of a belief system to the current phase of scientific development.
Because science changes.
Yeah.
It always changes.
Precisely. The history of science is inherently ephemeral. It is a process of constant revision and supersession. For centuries, the scientific consensus was based on Aristotle. If you married your theology to Aristotle, you felt great for a long time.
But then it was superseded by Ptolemy's view of the universe.
Then Copernicus and Newton revolutionized everything. Then Einstein revolutionized Newton. And today, quantum mechanics and string theory are challenging Einstein.
This is a massive structural flaw in Iqbal's project. If he works so incredibly hard to prove that the Quran perfectly matches Einstein's physics, what happens in 50 or 100 years when Einstein's models are fundamentally rewritten by some new quantum breakthrough?
Wait, this is a massive flaw. By working so hard to prove the Quran matches Einstein's physics, what happens if Einstein's models are fundamentally rewritten in 100 years? You've just accidentally tied your supposedly eternal sacred text to an expiring scientific warranty.
This raises perhaps the most important question for any belief system in the modern age. When you stretch ancient texts too far to validate them with modern metrics, you aren't just updating them. You risk destroying the very foundations of the belief itself.
Wow.
If your religion is only true because it miraculously aligns with a 1928 understanding of physics, it ceases to be an eternal truth. It becomes hostage to the fleeting discoveries of scientists. You replace divine revelation with a scientific textbook that is destined to be outdated.
That is a chilling realization. It's the danger of being too relevant. If you marry the spirit of the age, you are going to be a widow in the next generation.
That is exactly Fakhry's point. By trying to save the religion by making it utterly cutting-edge modern, thinkers like Iqbal might inadvertently plant the seeds of its future obsolescence.
We have covered an immense amount of intellectual ground today, and I want to tie this directly back to you listening right now.
Yeah.
While we have been journeying through 19th and 20th century Islamic philosophy, grappling with colonialism, naturalism, and relativity, The core struggle we discussed is universally applicable to us today. The tension between tradition and modernity never goes away. It just changes its clothes.
The underlying mechanics of how a system adapts to crisis remain exactly the same.
Think about it in your own life. How do you update your own core beliefs, your corporate cultures, your personal philosophies, or your national identities when faced with a rapidly shifting paradigm? Today, our turbulence isn't just the steam engine. It's artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, radical social shifts.
When the ground moves under your feet, how do you adapt without losing your foundational identity?
Do you act like Rashid Rida and look backward, trying to build a wall around a pristine past? Do you act like Ahmad Khan and assimilate entirely, shedding whatever doesn't fit the new modern mold? Or do you try to be an Iqbal, performing brilliant intellectual gymnastics to prove that your old beliefs actually predicted the new reality all along?
It is a precarious balancing act. And I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over, building on that stark critique Fakhry laid out at the end.
Okay.
We've seen the dangers of wedding a belief system to the current science, because science is a moving target. It is a trap. But what is the alternative?
Right.
If constantly updating and adapting your belief system to match the present moment risks destroying its eternal foundation, what happens when a deeply held belief system simply stops trying? What happens to a civilization or a philosophy when it decides to stop chasing relevance, stops trying to speak the language of the present, and instead simply waits out the clock, banking entirely on outlasting the future?
That is a heavy question to carry with you. We've seen the software update fail, but what happens when you just refuse to install it at all? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into your custom sources. Your curiosity is what drives this show, and we love exploring these massive paradigm shifts with you. Bring us another stack of notes, and we will see you on the next intellectual adventure.